Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of Korean Studios podcast. My name is Kim Gi-hwan. Now, today's topic is drinking alcohol. And I do appreciate that in some parts of the world, it's not an acceptable behavior. And in some parts of the world, I think it's illegal in many parts of the world as well. But in Korea, drinking is a very common social activity. So whether you're meeting your friends for dinner or for an evening out, or whether you are out for dinner or drinks for work purposes, alcohol is always sort of involved somewhere in that setting. So if you are learning Korean and you intend to visit Korea in the future, I think it will be useful to be aware of certain cultural norms and etiquettes related to the social activity of drinking. So that's what we're going to talk about, and we're going to be talking about a lot of different cultural aspects, but along the way, we'll also help you to learn useful vocabulary related to drinking. Okay, so today's talk is going to be divided into three different areas. We're first going to talk about the concept of anju, and anju is basically food you eat with drinks. And anju is really important. It's an absolute must element when you're drinking. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And we're also going to talk about how drinking in Korea is a social activity. And what that means is that drinking in Korea is very much a group activity. And we'll talk about why and how drinking is a group activity in Korea. And lastly, we're going to talk about certain rules that we have to follow when we're drinking in order to be respectful, particularly when we're drinking with people who are older than us. Now, in Korea, bars are called 술집. The word 술 means alcoholic drink, and 집 is commonly used to talk about houses and homes, but we also use 집 to refer to different kinds of shops and restaurants. And 술집 is a general word that refers to all the different sort of places that sell alcohol. But there are other more specific names that refer to different kinds of bars. One of them is called 포장마차. And in the old days, 포장마차 were these like huts out on the street where people would go into these sort of like tent-like structures. But nowadays they've become a lot more fancy and upmarket. And when people talk about 포장마차 nowadays, they are referring to sort of like retro style bars in Korea. And 포장마차 is often referred to its shortened form, 포차. And another sort of 술집 that people go to is called 호프집. And this is where they sell draft beer. And I think the word 호프 comes from another country. I'm not exactly sure where, but I think most Koreans think that 호프 comes from Germany. I don't know if it does. I'm limited knowledge of German, unfortunately. But yeah, 호프집 is basically where, maybe it's because it served beer, that's why people think it's from Germany. But 호프집 is where you get draft beer. And obviously in Korea there are also lots of Western style bars where you can buy sort of like individual beers, or you can get like whiskey shots and so on. And these are just called ba. So it's basically bar said phonetically in Korean, ba. But all these different places are referred to as 술집, a place that serves alcoholic drinks. But in Korea, you can obviously go to these like places that are dedicated to serving alcohol, but it's also very common for Korean people to come together in restaurants and drink alcohol. Now, obviously, the concept of eating and drinking is also common in other countries as well, but in Korea, people would go to these restaurants, have their meal, and they'll probably have drinks together with the meal. But once they've finished their meal, they will order maybe a bit more food and alcohol and stay there and just continue to sit there and eat and drink, possibly 1 or 2 hours more after the meal. So it's also very common for people to just sit in restaurants and spend a long time drinking as well. Okay, so let's consider what happens when you go to a Korean bar. Now, the first thing that happens is that you'll be seated at a table, and that shouldn't feel too alien. It's pretty common concept, I think. And then as a group, you will order food and drinks, and all that food and drink that you order is to be shared between everyone at the table. And that setting where you have all the food and drinks and you have the people there and you're ready to have a good time, and that setting is called 술자리, 술자리. And the word 자리 means a place. So it's like 술자리 literally means alcoholic place or alcoholic party setting. And that's where the fun sort of begins, obviously. And the food that you order with 술 is called 안주. And there are many different kinds of anju that you can order. And in Korea, Korean people tend to have, I say tend to, it's almost quite strictly adhered to, but they have certain anju with certain alcoholic drinks. So the three, okay, I won't talk about every alcoholic drink, there's just too many, but the three most common alcoholic drinks are soju, 맥주, and 막걸리. So soju is obviously soju, and 맥주 is beer, and 막걸리 is a type of, I'll call it rice wine. I don't know whether that sort of describes what that is exactly, but 막걸리 is a very traditional rice wine drink in Korea. And in terms of the soju, it's spelled with a 시옷. It looks like soju, and that's probably how newsreaders will pronounce that word, but in general, sort of like everyday setting, most people will call it soju, but some people do call it soju. So, you know, soju or soju, it doesn't really matter how you pronounce it, but it's commonly just pronounced soju. And with soju, the most common types of anju are anything that's soup-based. So I'm just going to sort of like talk about certain types of anju, and one of the most common types of anju that you have with soju is something called 오뎅탕. 오뎅탕. And that's a soup-based dish with like fish cake things. I don't know how to describe in words, but 오뎅탕 is a very common type of anju with soju. And another really common anju with soju is 회. And 회 is like raw fish, sashimi. And any kind of like barbecue meat is good with soju. And in terms of 맥주, beer, 맥주 goes well with fried chicken, and fried chicken in Korean people just refer to it as chicken. And because these 맥주 and chicken go so well together, like chicken and 맥주, we often refer to this combination as 치맥. So you hear Korean people talk about, let's have 치맥 this Friday. Let's go for 치맥. That just means chicken and beer. And beer also goes well with any kind of fruit. And also there's something called 오징어, and this is like a dried squid snack, 오징어, which is amazing. If you've never had it, I don't know whether you can buy it where you are, but definitely very common in Korea. And 막걸리 is, as I said, it's a traditional Korean rice wine, and the most typical anju that you have with 막걸리 is something called 전, which is a kind of like a traditional Korean pancake, though it's very different from a pancake that you would get in America or the UK. But it's a Korean style pancake. But 전 is probably the most common type of anju that you will have with 막걸리. Now, there are many other different kinds of anju available in Korea. So I've only talked about like 5 or 6, or I don't know how many I've talked about, but very few types of anju. There are lots and lots of different kinds of anju that you can have. And not every anju is restricted with, like, associated with one drink. There are many different kinds of anju that you can have with different kinds of drinks. So you don't always have to have this drink with this dish. There are different kinds of things that you can have as well. But certain types of anju is only had with a certain type of drink. So if you went to Korea and someone said, oh, why don't we go for some food and drink, and you said, oh, let's have soju and chicken, then that Korean person will probably look at you and give you a funny look and think that you are talking crazy, because nobody has soju and chicken. You have 맥주 and chicken, or soju and some other anju. So there are certain types of alcoholic drinks that Koreans will only have with certain anju. So be aware of that if that discussion is to be had in Korea. Now, the other really important thing to note about anju is that Koreans will always have anju. So Koreans will always eat food with drinks. They won't drink. So they won't just drink. Even if like you've gone out for a meal and you're pretty full and you go to like a 술집 for more drinks, even though you're full, you want some food with the drink, even if just to nibble on. So the idea of drinking without anju is very foreign to a lot of Korean people. So obviously in like Western, if they were to go abroad, to go to pubs and bars, depending on where you go, you might only drink, and that feels a little uncomfortable. There should be maybe like some crisps in the UK. If you go to a pub in the UK, you might get some crisps. So they'll want to get something there, so that if you're drinking a pint of beer, you can have a little snack of something. So anju is a very important, integral part of drinking in Korea. Now, let's move on to the second topic of today, which is that drinking in Korea is a group activity. And to further sort of illustrate this, let's imagine that you go to a 술집 with two of your friends. So there are three of you now at the 술집. And your two friends, so let's imagine that your two friends want to drink soju, but let's say that you had a really bad experience with soju the week before, so you're not in the mood for soju, so you want 맥주. So together, the three of you order 2 bottles of soju and a bottle of 맥주. And you also order a couple of anju that will go with soju and 맥주. Now, at this stage, just because I said I want to drink 맥주, it doesn't mean that 맥주 is only for me. All the drinks on the table, as well as the food, is shared by everyone. And this concept of sharing the food and drinks on the table applies not just at a 술자리, but also around the dinner table too. So whatever alcoholic drink there is on the table, everyone can just sort of grab what they want. It's not limited to or restricted to one or two individuals. And this is a big cultural difference because and just to sort of give you an example of a story that my father told me of when he went out for a business meeting, and he told me about a time when he was at this dinner table, and I think one of his business partners had ordered a bottle of wine and he hadn't, but there were wine glasses everywhere and he had his own wine glass. So I think he just assumed that whatever alcoholic drink that people had ordered, he could just sort of pour himself a glass of wine. So he went to grab the bottle of wine to pour himself some wine, but obviously this bottle had been ordered by someone else. And so while he was trying to do it, the other person sort of grabbed my dad's hand and said, "What are you doing? That's my bottle of wine." So that startled my father. But remember that he'd been brought up in a culture where, whatever alcohol on the table is to be shared by everyone. So that's a big cultural difference. So if you do drink with Korean people and just because you wanted beer and other people wanted soju, it doesn't mean that beer on the table is just for you. It's to be shared by everyone. So it's very important to be aware of that. Now, another important aspect of drinking in Korea is that you should always drink together. And this sort of reinforces that idea of drinking as a group activity. So let's say that that scene where you and your two other friends are there and everyone has a glass of soju. So I have this is just water, by the way, and this is a bit different from a soju glass. This is more like a whiskey shot glass, but I don't have a typical soju glass at home. But anyway, so let's say I want to have a drink. So if I raise my glass like this, then this is a sign that I want to have a drink. And others will kind of like see that and they go, okay, let's drink together kind of thing. All right, they'll automatically raise their glass. Now, if they don't, then I could just drink by myself. It really depends on the setting, but I may insist that we drink together, and I'll say something like 한잔 하자, and 한잔 하자 means let's have a drink. Or I may say, if it's a formal setting like a work environment, it depends on the setting, but a formal way of saying let's clink the glass together, it means the formal expression is 건배하다. So I may say, oh, 건배합시다, or 건배하자. But so the word 건배 means a toast. So it's like let's have a toast kind of thing. That's a way of saying let's clink the glasses together. But that's a formal expression. In a more social setting, more informal setting, the expression for let's clink the glasses together is 짠하다, 짠하자. So 짠하다. So I will say 짠하자, and it means like let's clink the glasses and have a drink. So throughout the night, someone will suggest having a drink, and that means raising your glass and clinking glasses together. So if you're drinking with Korean people, you're going to be hitting glasses, clinking glasses multiple times a night, and which kind of I think brings people together. So I think it's sort of it makes the whole thing a bit more of a social event, a bit more fun, I think. But yeah, so just be aware of that. Now, the third important thing about this sort of like group activity, drinking being a group activity, is that you have to make sure you have to pour drinks for other people. And so let me just empty this glass. Just water, just to remind you. So let's say, for example, I've just finished that and I've put it down on the table. Now, in a Korean 술자리, the drink setting, if someone has an empty glass, as a participant of that time of fun, I have to make sure that glass is filled up as the other person in that group. So if my friend's glass is empty, I have to just water. Pick up the drink and then pour him a drink. So I have to be the one pouring. And this idea of pouring for each other is really important. Now, the important part to all this is that you have to pour someone a drink when the glass is empty. In Korean, the act of pouring someone a drink when there is already some drink in the glass is called 첨잔. 첨잔. And 첨잔 is not something Koreans do. So we never, like if you do it, it's not disrespectful, but it's something that Koreans frown upon. So let's say, for example, and here's another sort of situation. So let's say, for example, I pick up a bottle of soju or bottle of beer, and there are four other people in the group. And the glass is empty for 3 people, but one person maybe has like a little bit left. But let's say, for example, I'm going around and pouring beer for other people. And then while I'm at it, I want to pour this person a drink as well. But there is already some drink in there, and I don't want to, give him a top up. So I say, oh, come on, like empty that glass. And so then the person will pick up the glass, empty it so that they can allow the other person to pour them a drink. And this concept is really important, that you're pouring into an empty glass, as I said. So 첨잔 is the act of pouring into a glass where there is already drink, and that's not something that Korean people do. Now, the other thing to note is that when someone is pouring you a drink, that you hold that glass in your hand. So when someone is pouring a drink, that glass, you don't just leave the glass on the table and go, yeah, go on, you pour drink into that glass, and I'll just sort of won't be a participant in it. No. If someone's pouring you a drink, you hold it and you receive it, and when that person's pouring a drink. Shortly in a minute, when we talk about being respectful, I'll talk about different ways of receiving the drink, depending on who's pouring. But it's important that you have your hand on the glass while the drink is being poured. But this whole thing about pouring is, as I said, it's not So like if you pour yourself a drink, it's not a disrespectful thing. It's more of like a social rule that people follow. So let's say, for example, like someone's not pouring me a drink, and I want to have a drink. So I may pick up the bottle and pour myself a drink. Now, this isn't like me hinting that, oh, why aren't you pouring me a drink? I'm just, hey, I'm going to pour myself a drink. But when I do that, some people might there are two things that can happen. Someone might grab the bottle out of my hand and go, oh, but not in a rude way. They'll just kind of like, they won't snatch, but they'll grab the bottle out of my hand. Hey, let me pour you that drink. Don't pour yourself. So they'll grab it, and then the polite thing to do is just let that person take the bottle. And then you grab the glass, and then the other person will then pour you the drink. Now, the other thing that might happen here is that if you are pouring yourself a drink, maybe you have already sort of, before they were able to take the bottle out of your hand, you've already started pouring yourself a drink. Then the other person will put their hand on your glass, and as sort of like to suggest that, oh, okay, well, you shouldn't be pouring yourself a drink, but since that drink is being poured, I'll put my hand on your glass to receive that drink. So those are two sort of scenarios that might happen if you do end up trying to pour yourself a drink. And that's sort of like a very common behavior around 술자리 when you're drinking with Korean people. So do keep that in mind. So important thing is that when you're drinking with Korean people, always be mindful of whether other people's glasses are empty. And if someone's glass is empty, then grab a bottle of whatever alcohol is around and pour that person a drink so that the glass is always sort of full around the table. So that's a very important etiquette to follow. Okay, so far we've been talking about some important, we've talked about anju, and we talked about some important rules or social norms and etiquettes related to how drinking in Korea is a group activity. So let's now talk about three very important, and these are very, very important rules that we need to follow to be respectful when we're drinking with people with seniority. Now, the first one, and this is, although we're going to talk about three things, this is the most important one. Even if you forget the other two, this is absolute must. You can't forget this one. And this is where, and we talked about how you have to pour drinks for other people and receive drinks. If you are pouring for someone with seniority, or you are receiving a drink from someone with seniority, then you have to use two hands. So there are two ways of doing this. You can pour with two hands like this and receive the alcoholic drink with two hands like this. I'm going to empty this, sorry. So you can do it with two hands like this. Oh, there are different ways of doing it, but as long as you're holding it with two hands. And the other thing is you can pour with one hand, but support the other arm with the other hand. And this is another common way of doing it as well. And similarly, if you're receiving a drink, you can hold the glass with one hand and support that arm with the other hand and just receive it like that. Some people do it like this. There are different sort of actions, like they'll do this, they'll do that, or they'll do that. You can see my arm there kind of thing, right? And both are fine, whether you're holding it with two hands or supporting the other arm with one hand, the other hand, and they're both fine. Whichever way you do it is fine. Now, one thing you must never do is to pour the drink or receive drink using just one hand when you're drinking with someone with seniority. And I cannot emphasize this enough because it is the ultimate disrespect. I mean, it's basically end of that relationship. If you decide to go, hey, like my father-in-law, let me pour you a drink with one hand. It's the end of the relationship. I don't think anyone in Korean history has ever done that. It's that bad. It's obviously a bit of an exaggeration, but it's pretty bad. I'm just trying to imagine what would happen if you did that, but I don't know of anyone who's ever done it. So as I said, I'm going to talk about other two things that you can do to be respectful, but this is the most important one. So you pour drinks with two hands and you receive with two hands if you're pouring or receiving from someone with seniority. So don't ever forget that you do this. Okay. Now, the second important thing is to when you are drinking with someone with seniority, that obviously let's say, for example, you've received with 2 hands. Now it's time for you to drink. When you drink, you don't drink facing that person. You have to turn sideways a little bit and drink like this. So you drink and then come back down. Now, it depends on who you're drinking with a little bit, because if let's say for example, I'm drinking with my a very senior manager of my company, or I'm drinking with my father-in-law, then I will turn my head sideways and drink with 2 hands like this. But if, let's say for example, I'm drinking with my uncle, then I know him quite well, but at the same time he's much older than me, then it depends on the relationship. There's a lot of different factors involved, but I may turn and drink with 1 hand. And so it varies. It really depends on how much seniority they have. So for example, with my cousins who are maybe like 5 years older, I may not do it at all. And I probably won't, actually, because we're kind of close. But so it depends on that, how the difference in age and also the level of familiarity, and that will dictate that. But the important thing is, if you need to be respectful, then definitely turn your head sideways and drink with 2 hands like this. So that's the second really important thing that you need to do to be respectful when you're drinking in Korea. Now the third one, and this is probably the least important one, but it depends on the setting. So as I mentioned earlier, it's doing 건배, so 건배하다 or 짠하다, clinking glasses, is very common practice when you're drinking in Korea. And if you're drinking with someone who has, let's say for example, you're drinking with the 사장님 of your company. So let's say you work at a company where, a few hundred people work at this company, and you're working with 사장님, who's maybe like 20 years older, and he has, he's a very senior person in your organization. So let's say you're at a work do, he comes over and he wants to have a shot with everyone, and he wants to do 건배. Now, when you do 건배 with your 사장님, you should, so I've only got 1 glass. So let's say this is his glass and this is your glass. You don't clink at the same height. You go in lower. So you're clinking sort of the bottom half of his glass. And that's to be respectful. And I would recommend only doing this when there is that great difference in your positions in the hierarchy. So as I said, if you are a fairly low level employee in the company and the person you're doing it with, clinking with, is a very senior person in the company, or let's say for example you are drinking with maybe your in-laws, your wife's grandparents or something, then when you're clinking, you should go lower to be respectful. But again, it's not a very common practice. It's not something you have to do with someone who's maybe your direct manager, or someone that you know well but is older than you. It's not something that you have to follow. But if there is a need to show that extra respect, then it's something that you should do. So clink the bottom half of the other person's glass. So you can go in low and then clink and then drink sideways. Yeah, so do remember that. Okay, so that's it for today's episode, and I hope this was an insightful sort of lesson into the culture of drinking in Korea. And if you do have plans to drink with Korean people in the near future, hopefully today's lesson or the episode has helped you to gain a much better understanding of certain rules and cultural norms that you have to follow in that setting of drinking alcohol. Okay, so thanks for watching or listening to today's episode, and I look forward to seeing you soon again. Bye-bye.